Hey all you cool cats and kittens, I hope everyone had a great Easter weekend. Today we're going to be talking about some of the statistics surrounding foreign aid, in particular American Official Development Assistance, where it goes, how successful it's been, and we'll also get a little bit into varying perspectives on how aid flows affect governance, as well as a kind of rivalry that's been emerging between the United States and China in the aid sector. So this is going to be a fairly lengthy discussion and a lengthy presentation, so bear with me. I think we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 slides to get through. I will try to be as concise as possible. So before we begin, I've got a brief class announcement. I will be releasing later today, ideally sometime this afternoon, the assignment guidelines for your second policy brief. So that is going to be posted later today on Moodle. Keep an eye open for that. I am well underway in grading your first round of policy briefs. I'm looking to get them back to you with comments by midweek, so just hold your horses on that. I'll try to get those to you on Wednesday or Thursday, so you should have plenty of time to incorporate comments from your first memo into the second one. So the second brief, as indicated on the syllabus, will be due on Monday, May the 4th at 11:59 p.m. So keep that in mind. Again, I'm going to post a kind of Turnitin portal on Moodle and have you upload your briefs into that portal. So again, keep your eye open for that, and I will be following up on this announcement as well. So let's talk a little bit about foreign aid, beginning with some definitions. So when we talk about foreign aid, in this context, we're referring to the voluntary transfer of resources from one country to another in support of humanitarian endeavors. So this money, these resources may be monetary, technical, or in kind. And also, it's not just aid in the form of grants. Certain loans, so resources that need to be paid back over a long enough period of time, may also qualify as aid. Generally speaking, a threshold of 6% interest on loans is the cutoff, at which point loans are no longer considered concessional, at which point they're considered market loans or commercial loans. So that's generally where the cutoff has been placed by the international community. So we can think about two separate types of foreign aid, the first of which is private or charitable or philanthropic givings. So these are delivered by non-governmental organizations, charitable entities for the most part. So things like Oxfam, things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're not going to focus too much on that today, although we will be talking about that later on this semester. For today, we're going to focus primarily on official developmental assistance, or ODA, which is aid dispersed by public agencies, so be they national or multinational. And this definition excludes military aid. So this definition focuses solely on humanitarian and infrastructural assistance. Military aid is a different ballgame altogether. And in terms of ODA, we can think about two separate types, the first of which is bilateral, which goes from one government to another, and the second of which is multilateral, which a lot of the funding will come from national governments, but the aid itself will be administered through international organizations like the World Bank, like the United Nations Development Project, like the Developmental Assistance Committee, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the like. So the vast majority of aid flows, globally run from country to country in a bilateral manner. So they're distributed by humanitarian offices within countries. So in the United States, the two big actors in that respect are the United States Department of State as well as USAID. So these comprise about 2/3 of total aid flows, and the remaining, about 3/4 of bilateral aid flows, and the remaining quarter come in the form of multilateral giving, again through agencies like the United Nations and the World Bank. So the vast majority of aid distributed in the world is done so on a country-to-country basis. So the world's top recipients of foreign aid, as of the year 2017, were Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and India. In terms of who the United States gives aid to, there's a lot of overlap. For the year 2016, which is the last year I could get data, the number one recipient was Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has a population of, I believe, just over $100 million. Just over 100 million people. And Ethiopia has been very savvy about being able to forge good relationships with different donor countries. So Ethiopia also gets a lot of aid from China, which we'll get into. Afghanistan, we obviously have a humanitarian relationship stemming from the war on terror and the United States incursion into Afghanistan. Turkey, Pakistan, and Syria round out the top five. So we currently give around $35 billion per year annually to official developmental assistance. So that makes us the world's top bilateral donor. But this is actually a relatively small percentage of our gross national income. It's about somewhere between 18 and 19%. So there's definitely room for us to grow, even room for us to catch up with what other developed countries are doing. So again, the United States is on the low side in giving in terms of a percentage of its gross national income. So the guideline that's been provided by the Developmental Assistance Council is 0.7%, or the United Nations rather, is 0.7% of gross national income. So as you'll see, Denmark is right at this threshold. The majority of rich countries fall somewhat below this threshold. The United States also falls below the average country effort of 0.39 of its gross national income. We're currently at 0.19 of our gross national income, or we were back in 2014. We've stayed relatively constant since then. So there's an argument to be made that the United States should actually be doing more to pay its fair share of official developmental assistance, and we'll get into that a little bit later as we get into our discussion questions. So within the ODA universe, the United States has had a number of recent successes of note that have actually managed to garner and hold a substantial level of bilateral support among both Democrats and Republicans. So we can look in particular at the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which is a hugely popular program that was established in the year 2003 by then President George W. Bush. So since it's been around for 16, 17 years now, it's comprised a total investment of $85 billion over that period of time, and it's estimated to have saved over 17 million lives. So at present, this is a $6.5 billion per year program, which funds HIV testing, antiretroviral treatments, a lot of them geared towards prenatal treatment. So a lot of the time, with early enough interventions in the pregnancy, you can actually make it so that children born to HIV positive mothers are not themselves HIV positive. Also voluntary male circumcisions, which have been shown to decrease the transmission of HIV/AIDS. as well as more on the ground frontline support for orphans, as well as healthcare training for domestic healthcare workers. So PEPFAR is its branding has been quite focused on sub-Saharan Africa, but it's actually active in 50 countries across the world, on every continent, with the exception of Australia. 27 of which are in Africa, which has been the global epicenter of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And it's been shown through longitudinal research that for each 1% increase in PEPFAR funding, you have a corresponding 0.35% decrease in the HIV infection rate in affected areas, areas that participate in PEPFAR. So can we look at PEPFAR as an American-made ODA success story that we should all be proud of and we should all look to build upon with further investments of this character and along this blueprint into PEPFAR, into developmental assistance. So again, here's a look at where PEPFAR is active and some of the activities that have been tied to PEPFAR. So again, one of the American development programs and humanitarian programs that across the board has received relatively high marks, enjoys a substantial amount of support from both political parties in Washington as well. So the big question here is, should the United States spend more money on official developmental assistance? So at present, we spend just under 0.2% of our GDP on ODA. If we were to spend 0.7% of our GDP, which is the United Nations guideline, we'd be spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 billion per year on ODA. That's presently around what we spend on veterans benefits. So if we were to adopt a more modest target of 0.3% of GDP, which is around the benchmark for other rich countries, we'd be spending $60 billion per year on ODA, which is about what we spend on transportation in the federal budget. So it's an open question as to whether or not ODA should be given that level of priority in our federal spending prerogatives. However, it's not all rosy, and you have a number of individuals, particularly in the economics profession, who voiced more skeptical views on foreign aid, who've looked at foreign aid as something of an anchor and a crutch, rather than a hand up for developing countries and for sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So one of the most strident voices in this respect is Zambian-born economist Dambisa Moyo. She presently teaches in the United States. She's the author of the book Debt Aid. So in this capacity, in her capacity as an academic economist, she's been a leading critic of the aid industry, and in particular, its effect on her home continent of Africa. So when we look at the aid industry, and in particular the branding and the focus towards sub-Saharan Africa, we can start with a very kind of shocking and galvanizing famine that took place in the early to mid part of the 1980s, epicentered around Ethiopia, but not exclusive to Ethiopia. So it was a famine that gripped Central and Eastern Africa. So this famine and the shocking and distressing images and news coverage that came out of this famine galvanized a kind of international community to respond to the hunger crisis in Africa. This was most visibly manifested in the Live Aid concert, which many of you will be familiar with. So this took place in 1985. It was seen by some 1.5 billion viewers across the world. Some of you will be familiar with the now iconic Queen performance that was recreated in the recent Freddie Mercury biopic that came out a few years ago. So this was a major focusing event and a major cultural event that shifted attention towards the plight of sub-Saharan Africa. And you have the subsequent involvement of a number of different celebrities and global dignitaries that has helped to keep the focus on Africa's plight. So one of the individuals that's very visible in this capacity is Bono, who many of you may know as the lead singer of the rock band U2. So Moyo's argument is that as the countries in Africa have come to rely on foreign aid to comprise a larger and larger segment of their domestic budgets, there's been fewer incentives on these governments to institute effective taxation regimes. There's been less of an impetus for these governments to have the administrative capacity in place, the accounting capacity, the absorption capacity to manage their own houses, to manage their own budgets, to tax their citizens effectively and to spend effectively, having been able to rely on this foreign aid as a consistent level of their domestic budgets. So you see here a cross-tabulation of aid as a percentage of domestic GDP and per capita GDP gross, and an almost perfect inverse correlation between the two categories. So Moyo argues that above all, aid fuels corruption and cronyism in Africa, and she has kind of a reasonable ground to stand on here. Objectively, you have some of the world's most corrupt, some of the world's most plutocratic governments in place in sub-Saharan Africa right now. The idea here is that aid, it severs the link of accountability that in developed countries comes from the process of taxation. When individuals are being taxed, they want to know where their tax dollars are going, so they're going to keep more of an eye on what their governments are doing. So that accountability no longer is in place when governments do not need to tax their citizens in order to finance their spending activities. So it's been estimated that corruption costs Africa somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 billion per year. And Moyo, being an economist, is also very concerned with how aid affects incentives. So the idea here is that a constant flow of Western aid dollars, it doesn't give African governments the proper incentives to change for the better. There's no need to make the kind of short-term pain necessary for long-term structural improvement. So there's no need to do things like take action to contain budget deficits, to build credit profiles, and find ways to access private capital as opposed to foreign aid. So this Moyo argues kind of over the medium or long term, despite short-term relief, entrenches and consolidates and even rewards a number of the negative government practices that have gotten sub-Saharan Africa into this position to begin with. So sub-Saharan Africa has a dismal corruption perception index rating. Across the continent as a whole, its rating is 32 out of 100, which is the worst anywhere in the world. So even the best countries to do business in Africa, Seychelles, Botswana, Cabo Verde, they barely cross kind of the high 50s and the low 60s in terms of their corruption perception in indices. So sub-Saharan Africa is, and I think understandably and correctly, still viewed by private actors as not the best place to do business, not a place where there's any level of certainty about governance, about the trustworthiness of bureaucrats and domestic businesses. So this has been a major impediment to sub-Saharan Africa being able to attract private dollars into the continent. So let's talk a little bit about moving on from the United States, foreign aid, how foreign aid might be affecting Africa. Let's talk about this growing and intensifying relationship between China and Africa, and what some of China's objectives might be as they take a larger and larger stake into the developmental and infrastructural sectors within Africa. So at present, China has diplomatic ties with all but one of Africa's 54 countries. The single African country that China has isolated is Swaziland, or Eswatini. So Eswatini has been snubbed by China because it still recognizes Taiwan. It's the one country in sub-Saharan Africa that still recognizes Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, which is a very contentious and a very taboo claim in the eyes of China. So since around the year 2005, as China has grown into a middle-income power with more in the way of disposable income, China has invested over $300 billion American into Africa. So just as of 2018, just as of 2 years ago, China's President Xi Jinping has pledged an additional $60 billion over 3 years for Africa. So you have the continuation of the relationship that's scheduled for the foreseeable future. So at present, the China-Africa aid comes principally in the form of low-interest loans or soft loans. And these loans are primarily administered by the Export-Import Bank of China, or Exim Bank. So your typical Exim loan will have a 3% interest rate and a 15 to 20 year maturity. So these are not loans that China will be able to make any kind of money off of when you factor in the cost of inflation. Inflation runs typically 2 to 3% per year. So these are loans that China is not looking to profit off of, but looking to forge a longer-term economic relationship with Africa off of through the instrument of debt. So here's another look at what types of aid are provided by China to Africa. So again, the dominant form of aid is in the form of low-interest concessional loans, typically administered by China's Export-Import Bank, or Exim Bank. So loans to African governments, so these are the figures through 2016. Things have probably changed and will change in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But sort of as of the most recent available data, annual Chinese loans to Africa have been following an increasing trend, peaking at $30 billion US in 2016. And these loans, unsurprisingly, are concentrated in the principal resource sector. So a lot of very attractive potential resource finds and prospects in areas like oil and gas and natural gas, as well as rare minerals. So cobalt and the kind of rare earth that goes into things like iPhones and tablets is found in plentiful supply in Africa. Communications and transport projects, which can be great make-work projects to employ both domestic African workers and increasingly Chinese nationals, are also quite well represented among the destinations of Chinese loans to Africa. So in terms of countries that have been on the receiving end of these loans, countries that have either large populations or attractive natural resource profiles have tended to be the really big winners. So you see Angola. Angola is one of Africa's real prize destinations in terms of its potential energy and mineral assets. So Angola, unsurprisingly, has been a very attractive destination for Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo, it has a number of potential rare earth assets, is another a very attractive site of Chinese investment. And quite controversially, China has been doing business with Sudan, which the United States and a number of Western countries have largely avoided due to its complicity and its perpetuation of genocide in the Darfur region of Sudan as well as South Sudan. So for those reasons, for humanitarian and human rights reasons, Western countries have been hesitant to invest in Sudan. China has been a major lifeline to Sudan on a number of different occasions, actually holding up potential and proposed UN sanctions that Western countries have wanted to levy onto Sudan as well. So here is a map of Chinese investment across Africa. So they're virtually everywhere. They're involved in every region, but areas in the southern part, the central part, and East Africa are especially prominent and have been especially important areas of focus for China. So areas in kind of darker shades of orange show sort of higher strategic priorities for China. In the year 2017, China opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti. So the United States, France, Italy, and Japan already had bases in Djibouti. So despite being a tiny, very sparsely populated country, it occupies a region of critical importance between the Horn of Africa and the Persian Gulf. So it's an area of high strategic priority for virtually all of the world's power players. A substantial amount of the world's oil will pass through that little bottleneck between Djibouti and Yemen. So there's despite its small size, it's an area of substantial strategic importance and attention from all of the world's big players. So this was a very important move strategically. It was a flex per se for China to be able to open a base in Djibouti and join a lot of the world's big players that had already set up shop there. So what are some of the things that have been motivating Chinese investments in Africa? So you can look at a number of different sources of motivation and potential motivation. So there is a drive of Africa to not only establish strategic influence and economic influence, but also garner favorable opinions. To be viewed favorably by both foreign governments and foreign citizens. So through its investment in Africa, and especially through its investment in sexy areas like infrastructure, like sports, building multi-million-dollar stadiums, building multi-million-dollar transportation networks and high-speed rail and things of the like. A lot of this is part of a PR offensive where China is attempting to buy favorable coverage and a favorable image in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or various parts of the African continent. And why the opinion of African citizens and African policymakers is so important has to do largely with how international governance is structured, which we'll get into in a few slides from now. So China also has a number of different exchange programs that it's set up to bring African students for a short period of time to study in China, and ideally bring back a positive image of China and pro-China policies and attitudes to their domestic countries. So part of why Africa's opinion matters so much, part of why the opinions of African policymakers and African citizens are so important to China is international diplomacy. the United Nations General Assembly in particular, it is run on a one country, one vote principle. And Africa just happens to have the largest delegation of any continent in the world. So there are 54 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the largest single pool of countries anywhere in the world. So part of China's charm offensive towards Africa can be viewed in light of its need to cultivate allies in order to establish a number of its more controversial positions through General Assembly resolutions. So China right now is pushing a number of very controversial positions in international law, principle among which is its one China policy. So China wants to minimize any kind of residual influence that Taiwan has in international affairs, and it wants to disabuse and disperse any kind of notion that there's any sort of shared governance or any kind of disputed governance between mainland China and Taiwan. China also has a number of controversial land claims that it's made in the South China Sea, putting it at odds with South Korea and Japan, among others. So it's through currying favor with the slate of African countries who ideally can be relied upon as consistent allies in General Assembly votes that China will hopefully establish those positions through General Assembly resolutions, which are very important pieces of international law. Thirdly, you can look at a lot of the things that are going on domestically within China in terms of how some of the areas of concern in terms of China's domestic economy. So at this point, China has made the transition from a low-income country to a middle-income country. So it's already picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of economic growth. Generally speaking, as countries become more mature economies, their annual growth rates begin to flatline. Countries that are relatively less developed grow at faster rates than countries that are more developed. So as China inches towards that kind of developed country profile, it's finding it increasingly challenging to sustain high levels of economic growth. So if you look at China's domestic consumer market, it's pretty much flooded. It's oversupplied with things like infrastructure and things like real estate. So you actually have a phenomenon of entire cities that have been built in mainland China where nobody's moving into. So these cities were built to give jobs to Chinese people working in areas like construction and civil engineering and short-term hospitality, but there was no kind of consumer demand that needed to be filled. So you're beginning to see kind of a worrying trend among Chinese policymakers and within the Communist Party of China in particular, of sluggish growth and China looking for avenues abroad to one, keep its workforce employed. So have Chinese nationals as well as local workers work on a number of these different projects in Africa, as well as to maintain high levels of growth by expanding the market for the things that it produces within China. So this can also be viewed in terms of a number of the incentives and a number of the concerns and potential challenges that China is facing at home. So are we seeing now something akin to a new Cold War that's brewing between China and the United States, specifically within the developmental sector within Africa? So here are the sort of quick and dirty of American and Chinese official financing into Africa. The United States still outpaces China as Africa's #1 benefactor, but China is beginning to close the gap. And in contrast to the United States, where the vast majority, the lion's share of aid dollars come in the form of official developmental assistance, A lot of China's official assistance are it comes through aid flows that are more difficult to categorize because remember, the vast majority of enterprises within China are still nominally state-owned. So it's more state-owned enterprises, Chinese state-owned enterprises, that are beginning to set up shop within Africa. And that funding is somewhat less transparent and it's somewhat more difficult to pin down as sort of qualifying or not qualifying as developmental assistance. So there's a lot of uncertainty amongst scholars as to even the empirics of Chinese aid towards Africa, and even what should be counted as part of those official aid flows. So by and large, about between 2/3 and 3/4 of American funding to Africa is spent on public health initiatives, which again have been largely successful. About 70% of Chinese funding to Africa is spent on infrastructure. So sort of in contrast to global health funding, American global health funding, which has been effective, but it's not highly visible, it's not sexy. Chinese infrastructure funding has been very visible, it's very in your face. These are very visible and physical embodiments of the kind of relationships that China is beginning to forge diplomatically on the African continent. So to give but one example, this is Addis Ababa National Stadium in Ethiopia, which is slated to open in the early 2020s. So this reflects a $160 million project that is a joint venture of Ethiopia's government and the China State Construction Engineering Corporation. So this is something, again, that is highly visible. It's in a very sexy domain. Soccer is a national and continental obsession in Africa. This is a very visible and a very effective symbol and emblem of the relationship that's developed in the aid sector between China and Ethiopia, which may have higher visibility, which may have more public relations and public opinion capital than the kind of public health funding, which is more kind of behind the scenes and under the surface that the United States has more recently pursued in Africa. So you have a little bit of public opinion polling that's been pursued within various countries in Africa on public opinion towards the United States and China. The general consensus is that the United States has a slight advantage in public opinion, but China is beginning to narrow that gap. And you actually have a lot of variation between countries, their favorability or their non-favorability towards either China or the United States. So African public opinion is still quite uncertain. It's still quite uncertain as to how effective these initiatives on the part of China have been in reducing the public opinion gap between African perceptions of the United States and African perceptions of China. So as you'll see, there is a lot of overlap as to where China, marked in orange here, spends its $8 and where the United States spends its $8. So typically countries with large populations, countries with attractive natural resource profiles, and countries with sort of historical relationships tend to be where these foreign direct investment dollars are concentrated. So how has the United States responded? The Obama administration played it coy. The Trump administration, unsurprisingly, has been a lot more acerbic about what it sees as a predatory China-Africa relationship. So China, the United States, the Trump administration looks at China's relationship with Africa in a somewhat cynical light. It looks at China as, at this point, setting up something of a debt trap, which will ultimately foster more of a asymmetrical and more of a dependent relationship as these loans begin to be called in. So this is the view of the Trump administration. And as of the latter part of 2018, the Trump administration, under the direction of then United States National Security Advisor John Bolton, unveiled an aggressive new strategy to counter growing Chinese influence across the continent. So through the newly established International Development Finance Corporation, the United States at this point announced that it would allocate some $60 billion over a period of 3 years in support of the United States, in support of American business partnerships in low-income countries, principally based in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, trying to meet China in areas like infrastructure, areas like power generation, where China has established an advantage over the United States, both in terms of investment and public relations. So I'm going to be doing something a little bit different this week. I'm going to leave you with 2 discussion questions. You can respond to either or, depending on what interests you. So again, as in weeks prior, I'm only expecting you to respond to 1 discussion question, but I'm going to give you an option as to which question to respond to on the basis of what interests you. So question 1, given the success of PEPFAR, should the United States increase its foreign aid budget? Is the United Nations recommendation of 0.7% of GDP, is that a realistic target? And secondly, will the United States-China aid rivalry end up benefiting the people of Africa? So is this one of the areas where strategic governments in Africa can kind of play the United States off China for their own benefit? So I'm going to leave you with those 2 questions. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I look forward to hearing your feedback and your forum responses. So once again, I will try to get the policy brief number 2 assignment guidelines out to you all by this afternoon. Thank you for your time. Have a great morning. Bye.